So my name is Jim McKeeth. My Twitter and email address up out there. I've lived in Boise for quite a while now. I've been involved in a couple of other developers groups, and excited to come here and talk to you guys about Android development. So this is an introduction, although I'm going to, how many of you are familiar with Android development? A few of you? Okay. So, all right, so this should be good for everybody then, it sounds like. I'll get into some best practices, so if you're familiar with Android, there'll be some new stuff for you to learn too, hopefully, but if you're not, then lots of good stuff here. This is an agenda we're going to cover. Yeah, good stuff. About me, give me my address again. I'm the lead developer evangelist for Embarcadero Technologies. I've been there about 2 months now. They're actually based out of California, but they work from home, which is really cool. They make developer tools and database tools. So ER Studio is a high-end entity relationship tool for managing databases. I don't understand all the databases tool side. But developer tool side, they make Delphi used to be owned by Borland. Borland sold it to Embarcadero Technologies along with the rest of their developer tools. And so they actually have a Delphi for Android coming out shortly. They just came out with the Delphi for iOS. So I know you guys are all Java diehards, but there's lots of options for developing on Android. That's one of them. Also, I just started the Google Developer Group, GDGB, which up until last month, we were actually meeting one floor below you guys here, which was interesting. But we have to find a new location. Although this month and next month, we're actually combining, because I figured, if I'm here, I might as well just do one presentation. Also involved with the Boise Software Developers Group. Anybody here been to the BSDG before? A few of you have? Okay. They're kind of a general software developers group, although they've kind of been a little more of a .NET centric lately. And then Boise Code Camp. I was actually the camp director the first year we ran that. A lot of fun. It's one of the biggest code camps in the area, actually, in the Northwest. We get about 400 people there, lots of great sessions. So come out and check that out sometime, or present if you like. Okay, so I like code, so I'm gonna just jump right into a demo, if that's okay. So I'm going to go through this a couple times. So,
and if you have time to set up the screen recording, that's okay. This may be quick.
I can do it. Let me do it real quick.
I'm not feeling as confident as I was.
Should be recording now. It's recording the audio too, so you can mute that out later and use this audio if you want to or whatever. Okay, so I'm actually using Android Studio, which is, they just announced at Google I/O. They have two options available from Google: Android Studio, which is based on IntelliJ, and ADT, which is based on Eclipse. So, show of hands, how many people are IntelliJ developers? Prefer IntelliJ? One. Okay. How many people here prefer Eclipse? Couple. What do you guys, everybody else use? You guys, Vim? NetBeans. Oh yeah, NetBeans. Okay. You can actually do Android development in NetBeans too. So Google doesn't have an official bundle for NetBeans support, but you can use that as well. So. All right. So we're just gonna call this my application. Oh, I can't call it my application because there's already one there called my application. So we'll call it my application too. So. Must not already be there. Oh. Okay. So when you're setting this up, it asks you what your SDK versions you want to use, and we'll talk a little bit more about different versions later. But the minimum SD requirement, this means this is what you're supporting this all the way back to this version is what this means. And so that limits what API features you have access to. This one does. So that's kind of the big determining factor. There's some other subtleties in there between the rest of them, but we're going to do it like that for now.
I have a question.
Yep.
Do this. So compile with, why does it give you options for compile with instead of advantage, disadvantage?
I'm not sure exactly why that is. That was something they just changed recently. Basically that's the SDK it's compiling against when it compiles. Okay, but your you want to make sure that your features are only, you're going to support the minimum SDK version as well. The target is then what in your manifest you say, I'm targeting this API, but then you were compiled with this API, but you're supporting at minimum this API.
So the compile with is really a superset right there, right? What you got?
Yeah, so I have to have this API installed on my computer. This is one that's installed locally. So if you see, I only have 17 and 18 installed locally. So this is what I'm when I compile my app, it's compiling against this API. And that can be any API. In this case, it's actually a newer version than my target. And then your minimum is the lowest end you're willing to support. Does that make sense?
So my compile with has to be at least be my target.
Compile with can be whatever version you happen to have. It's probably going to be the newest version, just because. But yeah, these two are the versions that determine what you can run on. So this is the minimum you can run on. This is the target, which is when your highest API level that is known to work with. So it actually makes sense to choose 18 since I'm building against 18. So this is the highest I know it works with, and this is the local one that I'm using to build against. Does that answer your question?
Enough.
Okay. So this is something they add here, so you can actually come in here and design your own icon really quick, so you can get going. So they actually have some clip art you can choose from. You can say, yes, I want to have a globe, and I want it to be whatever color. There we go. Nice red globe. All right. So, and you can also choose from a few different activity templates you're going to use. I'm just going to stick with blank activity for now, but you can see you can have like a master detail activity, settings activity. Some of these use fragments and have other activities attached to them, which we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So let's go ahead and do the blank activity, and we'll just leave the activity name and the layout name the same. Well, you can also choose. This is a nice feature here. You can choose from the navigation type whether you want tabs at the top or drop down, etc. So we're just going to stick with all the defaults here. And make a little app. Maybe not. All right, so pretend like that worked. I'm going to go ahead and show you. I'll run this application here. This one's got a couple buttons on it already, but okay. So when you run it, it comes up and asks you what device you want to run it against. And so here it is running on my device. It automatically connects and deploys it for you and starts it running. So this is a simple one here. I can type my name, say Jim. And then say hello, put my name up here, and then put a little, this is called a toast down here at the bottom, which is just useful for displaying little pop-ups of information. And this allows you to move between two different screens. Okay, so this is what I'm going to walk through and show you how this all works and goes together here. All right. Oh, one thing I do want to show you. How many of you have Android devices? Good. All right. So they do have an Android emulator you can get, but it is really slow, like really slow. So most people develop against their actual device. So I'm going to show you how to set up your device for development. In Jelly Bean, they changed it so that you have to actually enable development tools on your device. And you do that by going into Settings, and you scroll all the way down to the bottom to About Phone, and you scroll to the bottom of this, and you find the build number, and you tap this 7 times. It says, no need, you've already enabled developer settings. But if I hadn't done that, then I'd tap it 7 times, and after 2 or 3, it'd say, 2 more times, and you're a developer. And you just keep going, and also it says, hey, developer mode enabled. And they did that because in Jelly Bean, they actually introduced a lot of really cool developer features that do all sorts of great feedback. You know, hey, track my cursor and show me CPU utilization on the screen. And people were going in there and saying, ooh, what's this? And turning stuff on, and it killed the performance of their phones. And so they said, okay, we'll hide that so people aren't shooting themselves in the foot. So you have to go in and tap that 7 times. And then once you do that, then you have developer options here. And you got to come in here and find where it says Android debugging, turn on USB debugging. It's going to look a little different than this, probably, but there's something that says turn debugging on. And once you do that, then you can plug your device into your computer and debug against it. Now, if you're running on Mac, it just works. That doesn't need a driver for that part. If you're running on Windows, you have to find the ADB composite driver for your device. If you can't find that, then there's some ways you can hack the one Google provides to make it work. But yeah, extra step there. Usually it's not too hard to find if it's a mainstream device. All right, so let's go ahead and back to the slides. So I don't have my slides posted yet, but I will post them on gdbg.org, and then I'll probably send them to these guys as well, and they can post them on their site. These are some great resources for when you're doing Android development. You're probably all familiar with Stack Overflow, I hope. If not, check it out. Developer.android.com is the official Android site. And then developers.google.com, they have an Android site there for their Google on Android. And you can also watch all their Google I/O replays, which has got a lot of great information in there as well. And the last one here, this Vogella.com. This, if ever I'm stuck on something on Android, I usually find if I can't find on Stack Overflow, I'm just not figuring it out. I find myself on this site here, and this guy has just these incredibly detailed Android tutorials. They're just amazing, and it just blows me away how good a job he does on them. So highly recommended. Between the developer.android.com and Vogella, you're going to probably figure out everything you need to know as far as tutorial-wise, and then Stack Overflow will get your questions answered. Lots of good resources here. Okay, so let's talk about Android for a second. It's running Linux. They have their own version of Java called Dalvik, which was the result of the big lawsuit between Oracle and Google. It's Android OS. They have a bunch of apps on there, and the stack is mostly open source. Yeah, lots of dates. The one thing that's interesting about Android is they have each version has a version number, a name, and an API level. And it's kind of complicated to keep track of because it doesn't always line up. You'll have Jelly Bean has got 3 different API numbers and 2 or 4 different version numbers or something like that. So the name groups together a large grouping of versions. API levels can sometimes span multiple versions. And so it depends on who you're talking to as far as how they determine how they refer to it. But this is when you're picking out what your minimum SDK version is, this is important information to have. And there's a site, there's a link to it down there, but it's the Android, what's it called? The dashboard. So they always update this information monthly, and you can go here and check this out. But the interesting thing is, so Jelly Bean's the current version of Android, and it's 40% of the devices that access Google Play Store are running Jelly Bean. So that's really cool because that's a big chunk of devices. Ice Cream Sandwich is the previous version, and between the two, you're looking at 63% are running either Ice Cream Sandwich or Jelly Bean. So you're going to hit most devices by targeting those. So that's a cool thing, actually, because Ice Cream Sandwich introduced a lot of cool API features that aren't available in earlier versions. So if you're able to stick with that 63%, that's a good thing. You're going to get access to a lot of features that you want to as a developer. And then if you go back to Gingerbread, then you get 96%. And Eclair and Froyo are just little margins over there. A couple years ago, when I started Android development, Froyo was the leader as far as market percentage, but it wasn't the newest version. It's kind of annoying because you had to support Froyo if you wanted to get on a number of devices, but you couldn't have access to the features you wanted. So this is it's nice to see the graph looking like this, that we got some good movement in Jelly Bean. This is a history of when versions were popular. So the dates across the bottom. Jelly Bean's the green one, the lower right hand corner, and then Gingerbread's the big blue chunk in there. So you can see it at different times. Now I heard someone was saying that Jelly Bean reached its level of popularity faster than any other version, but I don't see that on this graph. It looks like Gingerbread might have beat it, but it's hard to say for sure. Or Froyo might have been faster, but I don't think we need to talk about this. There's a Linux kernel. When you're programming, most of the time you're going to be programming on the application framework level here. Right, so you're programming at this level here, but it's good to know that you can actually get down into the Linux kernel if you need to access different things like that. So there's a whole layer that you can work with, and so it's just a good idea to understand all the different what's all available here to you. That's the same sort of stuff. So one thing that's interesting about Android, and so that's why I have this slide in here about core applications, is Android actually gives you the ability to launch other what's called activities. An application is made up of activities, and so you can launch another activity and pass it information, and then when the user is done with that activity and hits back, it goes back to your application. And so that means instead of having to implement your own screen to display a map to the user, you just fire it off to maps, right? And then let them navigate in there, and when they're done, they hit back and they come back to your application. So it actually, you're able to leverage the platform's built-in applications much better than you can on other, on like iOS, for example. Okay, so I mentioned there's 3 different options for Android development. So let me show you. If you go to this site page here, the androiddeveloper.com/SDK, their current main one they give you is the ADT bundle. The ADT bundle is Eclipse plus the Android SDK plus the platform tools, as well as the latest version of Android. So if you download this right here, you're ready to go. All the tutorials on their site will talk about using the ADT bundle, okay, which is Eclipse. If you want to use the IntelliJ-based Android Studio, you can go here to this link here, and this is where you can download. It's version 0.02 or 0.2 right now, so it's still early access. But if you want to use NetBeans, you can come around here and say use existing IDE, and you can download the SDK tools for whatever. If you're on Mac, you can get it on Mac, or if you're on the other platform, you can come here and download whatever you want, or it detects what your OS is. So if you're a NetBeans developer, it's the link you want to use there to download that. Once you've downloaded that, there's a couple of tools besides the IDE you're going to want to be aware of. The first is the Android SDK Manager, and the second is AVD Manager. Now, if you download one of the bundles that have the IDE in there, then you have buttons to get to them. And I believe there's a plugin for NetBeans that gives you some Android functionality too, but is there? Okay, so here's the SDK Manager. So the SDK Manager is what you use to download new versions of the SDK. Okay, so when you download it the first time, it comes with usually the latest version of Android, but they come out with a new version of Android, you want to download a newer version. So you come into the SDK Manager, and that's what you use to download it. So you can come in here and say, you know, if I hadn't had 18 downloaded, I could download it. If I wanted to download, you know, an earlier version to test against, I could do that as well. The pieces that are in here, you have the SDK platform. This is the actual SDK you're compiling against. Okay, so that's the SDK. You have the system image here. If you're running the emulator, this is what you're running. This is the image that you run in the emulator. You can get the source documentation, and then Google has actually their own APIs that sit on top of Android. And so if you're wanting to access like some of the Google APIs, like location services and stuff like that, Google Play functionality, you need to get the Google APIs. There's some other stuff which we won't really talk about, but you can get, they have 3 different system images on this one here. ARM, most Android devices are running ARM, so this is the main one you're going to want to use. But there's also, in Japan, I guess, Intel's Atom processors actually showing up in Android devices, and they're saying we're going to get Atom here in the US soon. But the interesting thing about the Atom system image is if you install the Intel Haxum drivers, is what it's called, it's the hardware abstraction layer, and then use the Atom system image, the emulator is actually useful. It performs fairly fast. So if you're using the emulator, look into the Haxum and installing that and how setting up. There's a few steps you have to go through, and then use the Atom system image, and that's going to give you some better performance. So yeah, come in here. You can download new versions. If you're on Windows, here's where. Oh, so you can download the. This is where you download Haxum from Intel, but it doesn't actually install it. It just downloads it, and you have to go install it yourself. And then there's the USB driver. So if you have a Google device, a Nexus device, you can use this. This is the driver you want to use on Windows. If you can't find your driver, you can hack this driver to make it work with any Google device or any Android device.
No, I have a question on this.
Yes.
So, if you want to support, let's say you want to support Honeycomb,
Mm-hmm.
do you have to download like API 10?
Okay,
From the
so
machine or not?
you probably will want to, so you can test against it, but you don't have to have it downloaded for your minimum SDK version to be set to Honeycomb. So if you noticed, I didn't have Honeycomb downloaded, but it gave me, was it Froyo, I think is what it was for the minimum SDK version. So you don't have to have it downloaded, but if you want to be a good developer and test on that platform and you don't have a Froyo device or ice cream sandwich device, then you're going to boot up the ice cream sandwich emulator, load it in there, and test against it on there.
But if I have a Honeycomb, which I do,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to develop for Honeycomb, would it?
It would make, if your target platform's Honeycomb, yeah, just download Honeycomb. You don't need to mess with Jelly Bean. Okay, so this is the SDK manager. The other thing you want to check out is the AVD manager, Android Virtual Device Manager. Nope, that's not. That's the device monitor. This is the Android Virtual Device Manager. This is what you use to set up an emulator running on your system. So you have to download the system image, and once you've done that, you can come in here and say New, and select. These are some configurations as far as device configurations, screen sizes and such. So I can say Nexus 7, and then what API level. So I've only got these 3 API levels installed, so that's the only ones I can test against. And then if I have multiple CPU images downloaded for those, if I had to add them, for example, which, nope, I don't have it installed, then it would give me that option here, and I could change this from ARM to Atom. So yeah, the rest of the information there is just for setting that up. Snapshots is a feature that lets you persist. So booting up the emulator is really slow. So if you use snapshots, then it saves your state and you can come back to it quickly. Used host GPU is a new feature they added. If you're doing something that's GPU intensive, then this will try and use your host GPU instead of the emulated GPU. So that can give you some performance benefits there. Neither of these are compatible with Haxum, if I remember correctly. So if you're using Haxum, don't use either of these. It doesn't disable them, you have to know that. It will, when you run it, it'll say, hey, these don't work with that. You know, that's right, you have to go turn it off. This is something new they added here, device definitions. So this is just some common device configurations. Any of the Google Nexus devices are listed here. And all it is it's a screen size, screen density, and RAM amount. So that way you can get an idea of some of the different devices that are available for testing purposes. Most Android developers use physical hardware as much as possible for their day-to-day development, and then use just the emulator for testing. There's some other services like AppKudo that you can actually upload your APK to, and they'll test it on all these different devices for you. Let me show you that. That's pretty cool, actually. AppKudo, AppKudo. So they have, I don't know how many devices they've got. Developers. 260 physical devices, and they add new ones all the time. So you upload your APK to these guys, and they drop it on all these devices, and it runs the little test script called Monkey that just randomly does stuff on your device or your app and sees if it crashes. If it crashes, they give you a crash report back, and you know if it worked or not. So useful for some testing. All right. Any questions so far? Yes.
At least when setting up a project in Eclipse, you need to add a compatibility libraries for the older stuff to
Okay.
work.
Yep. So there is. Good question. Compatibility libraries. Where's that? Okay. If we go into the SDK manager, there is down here under extras. Support library. And so what this does is they actually take, when they introduce new features in the newer versions of Android, they actually take and implement them in the support library as well. And so what that means is, let's say you want to target Gingerbread, because you want to get the maximum number of devices possible, but you really want this cool new API feature, you can use the support library, which then lets you include the support library in your APK, in your Android app. which then gives you the functionality that was introduced in a newer version of Android. So it's a way of getting around that limitation. Is that kind of what you're asking about?
Yes, so when you're setting up your project, you just click that here as opposed to installing it like you do in Eclipse?
So you would install it. You'd have to have it installed here, which I did. And then I don't remember where. I've actually used Eclipse more than I have Android Studio, so I'm not sure where it's at in here. Someplace in here you need to add a reference to that so that it gives you that one. Oh, okay. And then ADB. There's a bunch of command line tools, but ADB is going to be your best friend. It is a very powerful tool for working with Android. So ADB is the Android debug bridge, and it gives you all sorts of amazing things you can do with your device. You can actually create emulator images from ADB and stuff like that as well. It's kind of your entryway to everything. But one of the things, for example, is you can say ADB devices, and it tells you all your devices connected. And it doesn't see my device. So I'm going to do ADB kill server, and then ADB devices, and it will relaunch my server. And now it sees my device. So see, there we go. It sees my device. If you only have one device, it assumes all your commands are going to just that one device. If you have multiple devices, you have to tell it by serial number which device you want to go to. It explains that in here. One of the coolest things, so you can use ADB install to install an APK file. So let's say you've downloaded an APK, you can use install to install it onto your device. You can use ADB shell. And I've actually now in the Linux, running on Linux in my device here. So I can navigate the file system, wherever I want to go on here to, where's it at? SD card. You navigate around the device, so you can go in here and do some debugging and stuff like that. You can also use screen cap. And that wasn't what I wanted to do. That took a screenshot of my Android device and put it out to standard output in the shell. If you give it a file name, it saves it to a file name, and then you can use, if I go back out, I can say ADB pull, and then tell it the file on the device, and then tell it local file and copy it locally. You can just push it back on. So really useful when you're wanting to, it's like, oh, if I could just do this, well, ADB will let you do that. The other thing that's really cool is you can use logcat, which I'll show you a little more about this in a little bit. Logcat, ADB logcat. Logcat gets the log that's running on your device. So all the time, there's stuff's writing to your log. So see, it's doing stuff here. I'll talk a little about logging a little bit, but people leave their logging turned on in their device, in their apps, and you'd be amazed the information you can read out of here. But this will be error logs, all sorts of stuff gets printed out in here. So it's useful when you're debugging your own app. You can filter it down just to show your app, for example, or you can look at what other stuff's going on the device. So
That's the same that's output in Eclipse, isn't it?
yeah, Eclipse has it too. So you can get it from any of the IDs are going to have it, but sometimes you just want to come here on the command line and you can grab it from there. So. Okay, so Android development, you're developing with essentially the JDK against the SDK, and it compiles it against the Dalvik virtual machine. So it actually goes to a jar file, then goes to a DEX file. DEX is the Dalvik executable, and then that runs on the Linux kernel. That's what this is explaining. You're creating an APK file when you're done. It's a zip file that contains a manifest that describes your application, and then it has all the compiled code and all the resources and assets inside of it. Okay, so let's talk about the architecture of an Android app. So you have your application is what's called an application context, and everything in your application is contained in this context. And you're typically going to have one or more activities. Now I say typically because if you're doing like a I can't remember what it is. There's some class of applications now. It didn't used to be the case, but now you can actually make an application without an activity. What is it? I think it's live wallpapers. Yeah, if you do a live wallpaper, you don't have an activity, I think. And so your activity is made up of two parts. There's the class, which is the Java that you're writing to define what your activity does, and the layout. An activity, the definition of activity is it's a discrete set of I can't remember how they define it. Essentially, it's a screen. You can think of it that way. So each screen in your Android application is an activity. You also have your Android manifest. Your Android manifest defines your app to the Android operating system, explains how everything fits together. And then you have string resources as well as some other resources that are, it's just some resources that you can reuse throughout your application. You can also have other classes that aren't part of your activity, drawables, which are some graphical resources you can use. And then you can have some other cool features. You can have services. So something that's really cool is you can actually have a service in your app, and you can tell it that you want your service to start when Android boots. Okay, so you can actually have a service that runs in the background as soon as your device boots up and goes. Now, if your service is using a lot of battery, then they're going to say, why is my battery dying? They're going to go into the battery thing. It's going to see your app doing there, and they're going to uninstall, and you're going to be gone. So be careful, be judicious about that. But yes, you can run a service in the background all the time. Broadcast receivers is a really cool technology for sharing data between apps. It's kind of like a REST interface between apps, if you will. You can publish data and consume data between apps. So, for example, the Contacts app on Android doesn't have its own database. It actually uses a broadcast receiver to talk to the Android OS and consume the Android OS Contacts database. So what that means is another developer can produce their own Contacts app that runs and then talks to that same database. So if you change Contacts apps, you're not losing your database. Okay, pictures are stored through broadcast receivers. Settings are in broadcast receivers. The phone book's in broadcast receivers, etc. All this information is in broadcast receivers. In your app, you can consume these broadcast receivers, right? If you want to look up contacts in the contact database, you can do that. If you want to publish data to other apps, you can create your own broadcast receiver. And then content providers. I can't remember what a content provider is. It's probably cool. Check it out. Okay, so your application may contain one or more activity, or there may be another activity that's somewhere else. Okay, so if you have two different activities, the way these activities talk to each other, whether it's two activities in your application or an activity somewhere else, so let's say you want to launch the map or launch the dial or whatever, you use what's called an intent. Okay, so an intent is an object you create, contains some data, and you pass it to another activity, and that will then launch that activity or whatever. It's a way of talking to activities. You can use intents to talk to services as well. So you can have services in your application that only your application can see. You can have services that you actually let other applications talk to as well. So an intent is how you talk to services as well. So intent's the mechanism you use to communicate between the different entities in Android. All right, does that all make sense? Is everybody going to go home and look up what a content provider is now? Oh, wait, okay, so I'm sorry. I remember what it is. When I was talking about broadcast receivers, that's a content provider. All right, I went backwards. A broadcast receiver is the ability is what is when you say I receive these kind of messages, and so if you say I want to share something, for example, then it lists everybody that says I can receive a share message, stuff like that. So those broadcast receivers is sending these smaller messages out. So it's similar to a content provider, but not the same thing. Okay. All right, so I kind of mentioned this a little bit, but you have an Android manifest XML file that defines your application. Then you have these different folders in here, the bin files, the compiled DEX files. The more interesting places are res, which is your resources you create, and the source, which is your short Java source file. The source doesn't get compiled into the APK, obviously. That's only the bin gets compiled into the APK, but when you're working in it, you're going to see these folder structure. Your manifest, a couple of things about this. It actually defines all the activities in your app. So if you need to define the way your activities communicate to each other, that's defined in your manifest. It defines your permissions. So you know how when you download an Android app, it says, this Android app wants to call your mother or whatever. That's a permission that you say, I want to do this. If you try and do it without getting permission first and publishing your manifest, you get an error. So if you're creating an app and you're trying to talk to the network, and you get an error, you probably forgot to set your permissions. Okay, that's the first place you should check if something's not working. So as using Android, you're probably familiar with, you have the idea of a stack. So each new activity is stacked on top of the previous one. You can use the back button to go back to the previous activity. Like I said, you transition between activities using intents. And if you were, programmatically, if you want to say, I'm done, you can just call activity.finish, and that pops you off the stack and goes back to the previous activity. I'll just show you this in IDE, what the resources look like. Let's do that now. So this is a little bit different laid out than Eclipse is, and it'll probably be different laid out than NetBeans is. But essentially in here, we have in source, we have this is our res folder here and our Java folder. So our Java folder is where we have all of our classes we're defining in our application. Okay? And then our res folder is where we have our layouts. So our activity is made up of a layout and a class. Okay? So our main activity is this class and this layout. And now the layout is actually behind the scenes an XML file. You can actually come in here and edit the XML directly, or you can use the design surface here and drag stuff on there. That's one advantage of using one of the Google provided tools, is they actually have a pretty good designer now. A few years ago, it wasn't so good, but now it's actually pretty good. So you come in here, you define your layout, and then your activity here. Let's go to the activity. In the activity, right here, this line is where it loads that XML. So this is activity main. Activity main is that XML file. Okay. So if you see this syntax here, this R dot, R means it's a reference to a resource in your app. So this res folder is your R dot. All right. So I'm saying R dot layout. So there's layout, activity main. So that's a way of talking. That's what I'm talking about, is that specific XML file.
There's actually a Java, an R.Java
Yep.
file that gets generated for you.
There is.
So those are actually like constants.
Yep. And so sometimes what will happen actually is you'll come in here and you'll define something and you'll start working over here and you're like, where's my activity? I can see the XML file. Well, if you do build, then it'll build that R dot file because it hasn't got updated yet, and then all of a sudden everything works. So if you're ever in editing the R dot file, you're in the wrong spot, it generates that for you automatically. You didn't want to edit that. And then also in here, activity main, on your views you put down, they have an ID. And this is the syntax you use for ID, is @ plus ID /, and then this is the name, edit text. So if I want to reference that edit text in code in my class, this is right here doing that. And so what I do is, can you guys read that? Okay. Right here, that's the r.id.edit text, which was defined in my XML file. So I'm going to say find view by ID, and I tell it the name of the ID, and so it's giving me back a view. Now, view is the top level class. It's not an edit text directly. So I then cast that as an edit text and store it in a local reference for my edit text. And so now I have a reference to that edit text as text. Now I can put that in a field member and have access to it throughout my class all the time. If I want to put that in create, for example. In this instance, I'm doing it in my button click, just going and grabbing that. So I have a reference to it just for this one method. Okay? So in here, let's do this real bit. I could actually say label.get text. Why isn't it like that? Oh, duh. Lowercase g. All right. So now what I'm doing here is I'm going to go and I'm getting a reference to my edit text and my text view. So they're defined here. Here's my edit text, my text view. So ID text view. And then I'm then using, so I'm going to get the text off oh, I want the text, sorry. So I'm going to get the text from the text view and I'm going to put that in the toast. The toast is the little pop-up you see at the bottom. And then I'm going to set the label of, set the label, which is up at top, to the value in get text. And then I'm going to actually log that as well. I'll just log, log button clicked. All right, so I'm going to run this again. So I come down here at the bottom and hit debug and bring up my logcat. Now by default, this is unfiltered and you're seeing everything. Oops. Debug. Logcat. So by default, unfiltered, and you're seeing everything, and your stuff's going to fly past and you're not going to see it. So what you want to do is I'm going to come in here and create a filter. And in this case, I'm going to say filter by package name, and that's the name of my application, hello1. And then it filters it out. Well, you can also say log level. So there's different levels of logging. There's actually one beyond this called WTF, which is what a terrible failure, according to the documentation. So basically what this means is I want anything verbose or better. So even if you're saying, oh, I want error better, assert better, you're always going to get WTFs always show up, because those should never happen. If they do, you should know about it. So, so now on my app, if I why did that disconnect? All right, that's okay. The interesting part's on here. So I'm going to tap the button. Okay, so sometimes this happens where it disconnects. I don't know why. It's annoying. So usually what I do is I unplug my device and plug it back in again and hope it all works now. Eclipse does it too. It just logcat quits updating and disconnects. All right, let's see if that did it. Nope. All right, so we'll do this. ADB logcat. And I tap the button. And right there, see it? Button clicked. So is the log I just put out. You can actually put this in verbose mode and it'll actually tell you the information as far as which package that message came from and stuff like that. The typical calling convention, so here's the different levels right there. So that's I is information. You can do I'm going to tell you more about this later. Then you usually say the name of name of the class you're in, and then whatever message you want to send. I'm running out of time. Let me skim here. Oh, so you have other resources in here as well. That's what I was doing. I came in here to show you resources. So this is the drawable folder I told you about. Now, if you notice, I have different extensions on this -HDPI. That's high DPI. So the idea is that that's how you deal with different screen densities, is you provide different versions of your drawables for the different resolutions. So or the different densities. So they tell you what those different densities are and what you should design those like in there. So you can actually, any of these can be have this extension on it. There's a list of extensions. You can put the dash on there. So you have drawable. You have your main drawable, then you can have your drawables for different densities. You can have layouts for different densities. You can have layouts for different languages, layouts for different screen sizes, etc. Menu or values, this is where you want to put your strings in here. It's an XML file that contains a list of strings. That way it makes it easier to internationalize. There's a service called Lint that scans your Android app and tells you something you should do to improve it. And always say, hey, you got a string constant, make it a resource. You can ignore it or not, it's your choice. So this value V11, this means these values are only used when you're using API version 11 or greater. And this one's API or values used for version 14. So you can actually have resources for different versions of the Android SDK. And then I'll show you the Android manifest. This is the Android manifest. So in here, I specify the minimum SDK and the target SDK. This is the minimum I'm requiring, so everything I'm doing will have to work on this one. And this is the maximum I've tested against, is the idea here. So then you also specify, here's your application. In here, we talk about, here's our icon, our label for application. This is what determines how your application shows up on the launcher. And then you have your activities. So I have 2 activities in here, activity 1, activity 2. Here's the name. So this is the class, the name of the class that my activity is in, or that gets functionality from my application, from my activity. A label, and then the intent filter here is how I define what intents I want to get. Now, remember, intents are what you use to communicate between activities. And so main means I'm the main activity. You should only have one main. You should always have exactly one main. If you don't, you get an error. Main is when launcher launches your application, it launches this activity. That's the activity you start with. Or no, I'm sorry, launcher's this one. Main is, I can't remember who looks for main, but you have to have one main and you want to have one launcher. And that's how you say, this is the entry point for my application, the activity I start with. This one here, it's the second one that displays the message. And this one has what's called a parent activity. And that means if they press the up button, which is in the upper left-hand corner, I'll show you if I get the thing to work again, it goes back to that activity. So hello one main activity is this one. So when they press the up button, it's going to go up to the parent. Okay? Okay, let's go back to the slide. Any questions on that? Yes?
Is any default, do we assume any default size of the layout here?
Defaults for the layout?
Yeah, the size like 4 inch or 5 inch.
Oh,
Because it shows the layout.
there is.
But it looks like 4 inch handset, but we may have a 10 inch tablet or various size of the actual devices.
So there is it talks about, there's some slides if we get to it, which probably won't, it talks about programming for different displays, and there's what's called a baseline, and then they have different sizes beyond that. So the reality is, especially if you're when I work on both on tablets and phones, you kind of have to plan for that and test on the different layouts. That's one thing that's cool about in here is you can I can say I want to, what is this going to look like on an Nexus 7, and it's going to re-portion this for different devices. So that's a good way to get an idea of what's going to look like quickly, and you can change themes as well. But
and you can do things like it's got specified text size, and I can't remember what the measurement is, but there's a measurement that so it kind of adjusts proportionally for your screen size.
yeah,
Things like that.
so that's let's see if I can find that one. So yeah, when you're defining the sizes of things, you want to use DPs or DIPs or SPs. DPs are density independent pixels. So if you say I'm 1 pixel wide and someone goes to an extra high density device, all of a sudden that pixel is going to disappear. But if you say I'm density independent, then if you go to an extra high density device, that's still going to stay relatively the same size on the screen. Pixels, they give you these options, but they say don't use them because they don't understand scale based on density and stuff like that. And then there's also, I'll explain some more. Scale independent pixels is what you will use for fonts. Density independent pixels is what you use for everything else. And this explains what that means in more detail. So I want to talk a little bit about this here, the life cycle of an activity. So basically, when you launch your activity, there's a callback method on create that occurs. Now, if you look in the code, that's where you initialize everything in your activity. And then on start fires if you want to trap that, on resume, and then the activity is running. So most of the time, your activity is going to be in this state here running. Okay. So if another activity comes into the foreground, so on some devices, you actually, if you get a text message, you can swipe down from the top and save reply, and it brings up a little window that just says on top, and you can type your reply and hit send, and it goes right back to your activity, your previous application. That's just partially obscuring it, as opposed to, so that would cause a pause to fire, okay, when that happens, because another activity came into the foreground. But then when the activity is no longer visible altogether, it stops, okay? So when you're developing, you need to be aware of that your activity is going to go through these states automatically and respond to those things. So once it's paused or stopped, an app with higher priority could need the memory and your app could be killed. Now, sometimes I'll be telling people this and they're like, what? I don't like that my app could be killed at any time. It's like, okay, on the desktop, if someone pulls the power out of the wall, guess what? Your app got killed. That's life. So you got to be aware of that. Your app's going to go through these different states automatically. It's going to get pushed out of memory automatically based on somebody else needing the memory. So if someone pushes the home button, it's going to stay in memory as long as it can, but as soon as something else needs memory, it gets pushed out. So you want to, the reason this is important is because you want to save your state. So if another activity comes to the foreground, there's actually another event in there called onSave instance state, which is where you want to save your state. And then when, after it's killed, then in onRestore instance state right here, apparently I'll play with this, you want to restore your state, okay? Or if it becomes visible, if it's invisible, it's still in memory at this point, and then you'll get restart when it comes back in again. Okay, so you don't actually need to restore your state there because the application was still in memory. The activity was still in memory. Does that make sense to everybody? No one's gonna freak out on me about getting pushed out of memory? Okay. There's always somebody. Okay, so Fragments is a new feature that was introduced in Honeycomb. Yeah, Honeycomb for tablets. And what Fragments is, it's reusable pieces of an activity. So Fragments actually change that application lifecycle activity lifecycle I showed you. Gets more complicated with Fragments, but it's easier to explain that than tell you Fragments are cool. Go check them out. But basically, the idea behind Fragments is on a tablet, right? Here we're displaying two different fragments side by side, but on the handset, when they select something, then it goes to the next activity, which then contains the extra fragment. So it's a reusable chunks that you can then place on different activities, which is a good way you can deal with the different layouts. Intents, let me just show you the code for that. I tried to trim this down. Obviously, I did not trim it down enough. I apologize. So here we're going to create an intent on this button. So we're going to create a new intent, and then I tell it display message activity.class. That's the class I'm going to send this intent to. Okay, so you can have explicit intents and implicit intents. Explicit intents, this is an explicit intent. I'm explicitly going to this class, nobody else. That's what you're going to use to talk to intents inside, or talk to activities inside your application. Okay, implicit intents, or you're going to say, you know, if you tap a link in your email, it comes up and says, do you want to use Chrome or do you want to use the lousy browser that's built in? You always say Chrome. That's an implicit intent, right? You're just saying, whoever wants to handle this, go for it. So those are your, you can do it both ways. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually going to get the text from the edit text and get the message out of that, right? So I'm going to call it, here I'm doing the same find view by ID, getting the message out of that. And I'm going to, on my intent, I'm going to put an extra, and I'm going to say it's the message. And that string, it's a string constant I defined here. That way I can reference it later. It's a string, it's a name value pairs get passed. And I put the message in there. And then I want to say start activity intent. Okay? So what's going to happen now is this gets pushed up and it says, oh, you want to talk to display message. Display message, here you go. So now if we go look in display message, it gets created automatically. And then if you want to deal with what you got, then you say get intent. And then you say, I want to pull that extra message out. And in this case, we're going to display it on the screen. So let me see if it's not working. All right, if this was working, I would tap that next button down at the bottom and say next intent, or next activity, and it would display the next activity. I think I did that earlier with the text on it. So that's where that is there. Any questions on that? Intents are cool. Intents are how you communicate. Remember that.
So,
Yes.
quick question.
Uh-huh.
So, we talked about contact providers, and I'm using my Android, looking up more stuff about that. So it provides an interface between different applications.
Yes.
So how does that differ from intents in what you're saying there, right?
That's a really good question. Intents are for small bits of information, right? You can send some text. There's a few things you can do to serialize stuff. But if you want to really get complex, that's when you go to content providers.
Okay.
So a content provider lets you communicate an entire database, if you will, or entire table worth of data between activities or applications, where an intent is just, hey, dial this number or whatever, just little bits.
Got it.
Okay? Yes?
So with the intents, how do you get something back, like if you use the camera app or something like that?
There is, I think I have that in here. There is a, I don't see it. There's a, the activity can then say, you know, oh, if it calls get intent and says, oh, I was called by this intent, it can say, should I send something back? And there's a mechanism you can put something in there to send it back. So there is, I don't have the details for that, but if you look in the documentation on intents, it explains that. Views. So all the widgets are called views. You can have view groups as well as views. A view group contains other views. These are some of the different view groups. You shouldn't use this one at all. Absolute layout, that's deprecated. The relative layout seems to be the most popular one right now. And with relative layout, which is what this was using now, not that, this one. If you notice, I select this guy, it's got an arrow pointing up there to that one. Because in the XML, it says layout below the other. So my edit text says, hey, I'm below this other one. And so relative says defines everything's position by another view. Okay. So this one says I'm below that one. This one says I'm below this one, and I'm centered horizontal, stuff like that. So that's all defined in there. Yeah, you can define different resource layout for resources. Demos, I did that already. So here's the different levels, which I don't include the WTF. Sometimes I see that listed, sometimes you don't. Show. Okay, I think that's. Oh, so here's the different different screen densities. There's actually an XX HDPI now. I think that's 4. I don't know what it is. It's crazy, but. MDPI is supposed to be your baseline, and then 1.5 times that is your HDPI. 2 times the MDPI is extra high DPI, and I don't know what XX HDPI is, but.
I've got a question on it.
Yes.
When you put those in the res folder, if I don't want to size everything up, I'm just doing it for my phone right now. But I do then develop on another. I do then test on another phone. Does it resize automatically, or do you
It does. It will resize it, but it won't look very good. But it will resize it. Yeah.
Okay, so it'll do that automatically. But if I want to be good, I gotta
Yep.
just redo it.
You want to redo it. Yep. So this is the screen sizes on the left. Normal's the most popular, and then on the right we see the high DPI. It's kind of evenly split between those, but high DPI seems to be the most popular one. I think that's really, there's probably some other stuff in here. Oh, action. Oh, let me talk about best practices. Where's that at? Best practices. So support, you want to make sure there's some things you can do. And they talk about that link down the bottom, best practices, Android practices. Talks about some things you can do to support multiple screen sizes really well. That means including the different resource graphics, making sure that when things scale up, they all get bigger or smaller or move around as they should. You don't want, when someone goes to a larger screen, for all your stuff to be up in the left-hand corner. You want it to get bigger. The action bar is the new pattern that they have, and it's the, I'll show you what that looks like in a second. You want to use action bar. That's the best practice right now as far as navigation in your app. You want to build dynamic UI with fragments. We talked about persisting and restoring your state, and also don't block your main thread. All right, if you're going to do network activity, file activity, etc., use async tasks, which then fires it off into a different thread. And then you can test that with what's called strict mode, which talked about here. So this is what an action bar looks like. You've probably seen this in Android apps. You have this little navigation control you can drop down and move around. Your most common buttons are visible, and then you have the overflow over from the right that then can contain other actions that you don't need. There's a resource called Action Bar Sherlock. There's a link down at the bottom there that you can use to build action bars into earlier versions of Android, because action bar was introduced in Honeycomb. That's what async tasks looks like. I think that's it. All right. Turn on strict mode. Okay, that's it. I'm done. You guys are supposed to be over 7, right? So, is that right? 7? Okay. Let's try and hurry. Any questions?
Quick question.
Yes.
Normally in the desktop environment,
Mhm.
we understand that XML is defining the data, HTML is defining the layout, but here, Android, XML is defining the
Right.
layout.
XML defines the layout.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, the XML in here, if I go to text view, there's the XML that defines the layout. So
Okay. Yeah.
up at the top, I have my
So-
layout view. Yep. Okay.
It is a sort of the shift different from what we normally
Yes.
think about
Mhm.
about XML. So we need to change our mind about the definition of XML is different in the XML, right?
Yeah. Well, it's data in here, but it's data that defines the layout. So it's not going to be it's not on parity with HTML because it's a little different the way it behaves. But you're right in that it defines the layout, and then that's consumed by the class that then just draw the layout. Okay. Yes.
This could be a whole other talk, but just briefly, have you worked with PhoneGap and/or Accelerator, and how does that compare working with the investigation?
Okay, that's a good question. There's lots of tools out there for doing application development, and there's lots of arguments why one's better than the other, and you should never use one or the other. But it really comes down to different applications work better for, or different tools work better for different applications. PhoneGap, I know a lot of people do some cool stuff with it, but at some point it seems like you get to the point that it's not as performant as it should be. For most applications, not going to make any difference. It's going to be just performant enough, and that's fine. But for some scenarios, it can get not be as performant. There's also a native NDK, the native SDK you can download, and you can then compile directly down to ARM code and skip Java altogether. And so if you're maybe concerned about garbage collector issues or whatever, you can skip all that, skip the JIT, and go straight down to native with a native SDK. So there's a whole spectrum there. You pick what works best for your application. What depends on what you're familiar with a lot of times. So, yes.
Sideways topic. Can you talk about slide to unlock, or are you tired of talking about that? It's pretty cool.
It is cool. So what he's mentioning is, I used to work for Micron PC years ago, and they had this program to encourage engineers to file patents. And so I came up with this idea of using, at the time, your mouse, which is a pointing device, to authenticate yourself on the computer by drawing a geometric shape. And so, like, okay, that's kind of cool. And so extrapolated that out, made a patent, filed a patent about 10 years ago. Well, it turns out that's exactly what slide to unlock is. It's exactly what the pattern unlock on Android is. It's exactly what the Windows 8 picture unlock is all about geometric shapes that you're defining with a pointing device, in this case your finger, to unlock the device. So I'd forgotten about it, and apparently in the big Apple versus Samsung lawsuit, someone pulled it out and said, look, here's the patent that defines it, and this is the earliest one. And there was someone pointed out, had my name on it, and my friend blogged about it. I'm like, what? And I had to go look it up. Oh, sure enough, I did that. So unfortunately, I don't own it anymore. It was licensed off to Micron. So Micron owns it, so they're going to be collecting some big bucks. And I don't know if they'll send me a Christmas card or what, but it'd be nice. But my name's on the patent. You can look it up and see.
It's very cool.
Yeah,
That's really cool.
it's kind of cool. There was a couple other things well, I could get. There's a few other things that I came up with ideas for that didn't get patented that now Google's doing and .NET, Microsoft's doing with .NET and stuff. But that's another story. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
Eclipse versus Android Studio. Any good, bad, and different?
At this point, Android or Eclipse seems to have more tooling in it for working with Android. Let's see. Nope. But I think Android Studio could have that pretty soon. There actually is a whole. I clicked on this thing and it didn't do anything, but monitor relaunched. Oh, okay, there it is. This was the big thing that was missing, and I did for some reason couldn't get to find it. This is the DDMS, so you can actually come here and do look at individual threads and stuff like that. So I don't know, it's a pretty good parity at this point. It comes down to your flavoring, I get what preferences. From what I understand from people that have strong opinions, is IntelliJ, the Android Studio has better code editing features as far as refactoring and stuff like that. Honestly, I think it comes down to personal preference between the two. But if you're an IntelliJ fan, I'm sure it's superior in every way.
Migration away from Eclipse by.
I haven't tried migrating projects between the two, honestly. There probably are. There's going to be some issues as far as the way the project's laid out. I've noticed that for sure. The project files and stuff like that are specified differently. So I'm sure it's possible. There may even be tools for it, but yeah, they're not going to be 100% compatible as far as the project libraries go.
What about tool support, or support from Google for SDKs and using one versus the others?
As far as I know, that's on parity at this point, except technically the Android Studio is a early access preview version 0.2. So if anything goes wrong, they're going to say, oh, you're supposed to be using Eclipse. So it depends if you're bleeding edge or not, I guess.
Yeah, I guess a year from now, are they going to say, oh, you're supposed to be using Android Studio and stop using that Eclipse thing?
Well, see, someone asked them if they were deprecating ADT and Eclipse, and they said no, they're planning to support both. I know that a lot of people I talked to did Android development in IntelliJ, and it wasn't optimal experience, and it seemed to be more popular than Eclipse in a lot of circles, and so I think that's why Google made the move. I don't think they're going to stop supporting Eclipse, but I can't say for sure. Other questions? Yes.
So I'm more of a database guy. So the internal database on these is SQLite.
SQLite, yep.
Yeah. So as I understand it, it only supports up to ints. It doesn't do big ints. Whereas there are two flavors of SQLite in like the outside of Android, which will have a 64-bit implementation, so you can have larger numbers. So we do database related stuff, but it's web. We have Android app, but it's more the web side of it. So I mean, my idea is, well, if we can handle big ints, we can handle other stuff. We could actually locally handle stuff on the Android. So has anybody been implementing, larger numbers? Bigger, we just deal with stuff that's bigger than 4 billion, right? So
I don't know the answer to that. I do know there are other databases available on Android. So there's no reason that says your application can't bring its own database with it. It's just SQLite's built in. The company I work for, Embarcadero, actually has a Interbase database that's a higher end version database that's available that you can run on your Android device.
Sweet.
So that I don't know if it's going to do huge numbers or not, but you could check it out.
Sweet.
Okay, any other questions? Yes?
Have you worked with any XML GUI editors for the Android apps as opposed to using the built-in one?
So there's one called DroidDraw that I used to use because the one that was built in was terrible. But I don't know if it's completely gone now or not. DroidDraw. Because the Android one actually is better than it now, but you can it's a Java app and it'll run in the browser here. There it is right there. Yeah, it doesn't look like it's gotten any better since I last used it. It maybe has, I don't know. But that's, as far as I know, for building with native Android apps, native Android GUIs, there's this, and then the ones built into ADT and IntelliJ.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen some weird glitches in it, so I just wondered if there's other options.
I do a lot of mine in XML and just use this. I edit like this, edit in here and then use this as a preview, essentially. So, you know, whatever works best for you. There's lots of options. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, so yeah, I'll put the slides up on GDBG or gdgb.org, or you guys will have them posted here as well. So thank you very much.
Now remember, a week or a month from today, well, give or take, next month we'll be gathering at VSU for our Intro to Android Hack Night. So we'll get together, bring your laptops, we'll get you going on a studio. We'll figure out how many we can, we'll have people there. Hopefully Jim will be able to make it as well, and 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 be able to make it as well.